for joining us today for our Special Analysis Center ad hoc webinar. My name is Abby and I will be your host. Today I'm joined by Chris Lawrence, one of our technical consultants who has over 15 years working with clients and assisting with finding a solution to their problems. I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Chris because we have a lot of information to go through. We are recording this webinar. I will be sending out the links probably early next week. We will be asking some polling questions, and you should see on your screen the first polling question coming up right now. So if you can help us answer these questions, it gives us an idea of how to support you in the future. And we love having questions, so please use the chat or the Q&A feature to ask those questions, and we'll get to those at the end. Again, thank you so much for attending. We are recording this, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
All right, thank you very much, Abby. Hello, everyone. As stated, my name is Chris Lawrence. I've been with Meter Tech working on previously Bridgeway Products and Analysis Center for quite a while now. I recognize some of the names of the people who are on today, so hello to everyone that I've met before. The goal of today is to go through not Analysis Center itself, but specifically issues that come up a fair amount with people who are using the tool on a regular basis. I am going to do a very brief introduction to Analysis Center report building, just to use that as a foundation from which we can then talk about some of these more advanced techniques and solutions to some of the common problems that people run into. The first thing I'm going to cover is the very basic steps of building an Analysis Center report. First and foremost, if you have used Analysis Center yet, you'll recognize this screen at the top right of this slide. This is the Analysis Center query building screen. On the left-hand side of it is a list of folders that contain all of the reportable objects within the reporting universe. And those objects can be dragged from that left-hand panel to the top right, the result objects list, so that they show up on the report. That's demonstrated here. Matter name moving over to result objects. Similarly, those same objects can be used to filter the data that comes back into the report by dragging them from the left to the bottom right. And then those objects can be filtered against. Any object that can be reported on in the result objects can also be filtered on. There are different kinds of filter groupings that can be used. By default, if you drag just a single object into the query filter and then build a filter against it, then that's the only filter that is limiting the records coming back from the database. But if you combine multiple objects together in the query filters, you can limit the data to a more refined data set. Here, we're looking at the combination of a matter status filter and a matter type filter, so that we're getting just the cases where the matter status is currently active, and also the matter type is litigation. By clicking on the word "and," it will switch over to the word "or," and in this case, we would be getting all of the active cases based on active matter status, or where the close date is greater than or equal to the given date that's hard-coded into the filter. It's also possible to use the button on the right-hand side of the query filter area, just the third one down, to create what's called a nested filter. Acts sort of like parentheses around these filters. So we can create something like this at the bottom of the screen, where we're combining our ands and ors to say, return all of the cases where the name of a player is equal to Linda Lawson and her role is primary staff member, or the name is Patterson, or Paul Patterson, and the role is assisting attorney. Now, in version 4 of Analysis Center, which is potentially a version that you're on today if you have a very recently implemented on-premise installation, or something that you'll be moving to if you're hosted along with all of your reports, there's some additional functionality and tools available for you. For example, you can create what are called union queries if you take a look at the right-hand Venn diagrams, it visually describes how these work. The union query will take two distinct data sets and allow you to report on both of them together in one report. Minus will allow you to find all the records that show up in the first query and then don't include any of the records that are part of a second query. And then lastly, intersect, which will return just the common records between two queries. It should be noted that this is also possible within the current Analysis Center version 2 that most of our clients are currently using, but it's significantly easier in version 4. I'm going to go over how to do both methods in just a moment. In version 4, it's also possible to use inline subqueries to make more complex query requirements easier. In this example, we're using a sample data set to report on retail product lines. And specifically, the retail product lines, where the year of the product line is 2006, the sales revenue is greater than a to-be-determined amount. But then also, that line is not in the 2005 year's sales revenue greater than $240,000. So this would be the lines that specifically had an improvement over the prior year. And again, we can do this sort of a subquery in Analysis Center version 2, but it does require a bit more work than it does in the newer version of the software. Now, one of the ways that we will be using today to solve a lot of the potential issues you may run into is multiple queries. When creating a report, we start off, as I said, by defining the records that we want to see on the report, as well as defining filters that limit which individual records from those fields actually appear. Normally, for simple reports, you only ever need one query designed that way, but it is possible to have multiple queries, each one returning multiple data sets with different fields listed in the results filters, in the results and the filters as well. The way that you would create a second query is to first define one query and then to right-click on it, right-click specifically on the tab at the bottom left of the query building window, and select rename to give it some sort of a descriptive name so you know what data is coming back from this query. And then to right-click again and select duplicate. Once that new query has been created with the duplicate option, there will be a second tab at the bottom of that query window. You can right-click on it, rename it, and then change the filters around so that the data coming back for this second query is distinct from the records coming back from your first query. Once you have done that, you'll be able to click on the Run Queries button. Originally it says Run Query. Once you have multiple, it changes to Run Queries. And both of the queries will run at the same time. In this example, I'm pulling data from both 2006 and 2016, two distinct time frames. And so when I go to run that query, I then, in my actual reports available objects screen, will be able to see the merged objects from both queries represented by the multiple blue parallelograms with the plus or minus sign next to it, as well as, by expanding that plus, the individual query fields, the fields that came from the 2006 data set and then from the 2016 data set. The combined object is going to be the one that more often than not you're going to want to use for creating your report, because it's going to include the data from both of the data sets. The query-specific objects, however, are available for you, and you can use them to just display the data for that field from just 2016 or just 2006. This field definition on the right, if you're familiar with how formulas work in Analysis Center, will be defined with an open square bracket date, close square bracket for the combined object with all the data, or open square bracket 2016, close square bracket dot object name for the data specifically from the 2016 query. Let me step back here for a second. This is an example of a very simple reason why you might use multiple queries, just to label the data separately and to get two distinct sets of data for exactly the same fields. You'll notice that all of the dimensions, these blue objects, are all combined into single objects, and we have total build for our two queries as well. There are a variety of reasons why you may use multiple queries, and this is the most simple. It's also possible to do this same thing without multiple queries using variables and defining variables that extract the records that you want. So you would say, show me the date where the date is within 2016. So as with a lot of the portions of the Analysis Center system, there's always more than one way to get to where you need to go. When we get to some of the more complicated problems, multiple queries is going to be one of the best options. And in this case, if we wanted to find all the matters which do not have a primary staff member assigned, we can use multiple queries to mimic the minus functionality that I demonstrated in a prior slide. One of the first things people will try and do when attempting to find data that does not exist, like in this case, find all matters which do not yet have a primary staff member, they'll start by creating a filter against the role and setting the drop-down option from equal to not equal to primary staff member. Unfortunately, what this will return is every single record in the system where the role value is not equal to primary staff members. So that will be all outside counsel firms, attorneys, etc. So instead, what we're going to do to find that information is to first find all of the applicable matters who do have a primary staff member assigned. So the first query filter is going to be defined this way, where role is equal to primary staff member, and then any other filters that you may also have. If this report is limiting itself to a particular area of law or a particular region, you would add those filters here as well. Then you would duplicate that query and create a second query in order to find all of those cases that do not fit into the first query. The result objects will be the same. The query filters, however, will be much simpler. Instead of the role filter or any of the other filters, you can eliminate all of those and replace them instead with one filter based on a common field that both of them have. In this case, since we're looking at matters, we're using the matter name and number as a common unique field to relate the two data sets together. So what we'll see when running this example is a list, first and foremost, of all of the cases with all of the primary staff members, and then a second list from the second query of all of the matters without a primary staff member. Putting those together would actually result in all of the matters, everything with a primary staff member and everything without. So we then need to do one more step, and that's going to be to run the queries, and then instead of including in our final output all of the results by using the combined objects, instead I'm going to expand each of the combined objects and find and select just those objects that come from the no primary staff member query and drag them into the report. What I'm going to get in my report output then is just a list of those cases that fit my criteria for the report but do not have a primary staff member. Now, as an example of a union query, we go back to that original example. We have one query of 2006 invoices and another query with 2016 invoices. If we run this and then use the combined objects to create our report, we'll get both the 2006 and 2016 data. So that is the same thing as doing a union query in the newer version of the software. To do an intersection, we would do something similar to this, but then we would need to create a filter in the report itself to then restrict only the results that are present in both queries from showing up. So it's a little more involved. I didn't want to get into that here. If you do have a request or a need just like that, we'll be able to assist in creating those formulas. Now, these multiple queries are very important when dealing with invoices because it allows you to isolate different structured data in different ways. Particularly important when dealing with financial reports, budgets, and then things that will have multiple records unrelated to the invoices, but otherwise related to a matter. Because invoice data includes numeric data and non-numeric data, with the non-numeric data like text, dates, etc. in dimensions with those blue parallelograms, and numeric data in measures identified by the ruler, what the behavior of the system is to help create simple reports quickly. Part of that is that it will auto-summarize the numeric data within all measures. So for example, the total billed field from invoices will always show the subtotal of its data based on wherever you place it in the report. So if you place the total billed field next to the invoice amount, or sorry, the invoice number, you will always see the invoice total billed amount. If, however, you put total billed into the header of the report, then the system will auto subtotal it, and you'll see the total for the entire report instead. This speeds up the creation of most reports, but potentially can be an issue if invoice numeric fields are placed adjacent to certain non-related pieces of information. For most reports, invoice reports, all data that is added to the report, that it comes from the invoice, or any data result that comes from somewhere else in the universe for which there's only one value per invoice, or the matter that the invoice is attached to, those things you can just add directly to the report. We can drag a vendor name or matter name, invoice number, invoice dates, all those sorts of things directly into a report. We can group on any of them, create charts on any of them, just as we normally would for any non-numeric reporting as well. However, as we can see in the example at the bottom of the screen, if we add some unrelated data type, such as the player record, we may end up seeing information being listed multiple times. Because of how these because of how this data is structured at the database level, both of them are related to the parent matter, in this case the Carol customer matter. We have one invoice being listed, the 112322151, but we have 3 players. And because the invoice does not have a direct relationship to any of those players, the database will return all combinations of unique requested values. So what we see here is a listing of that invoice 3 times, 1 per player. Now in this example, because we're actually showing those players in the report output and we're showing all the detailed information about the invoice, including invoice number, we can see that this is happening. And we, at that point, will be able to resolve it. When this becomes more of an issue is when it's not necessarily being displayed because the report is not showing all of those detailed level pieces of information. So this is called a Cartesian product, and it can occur when mixing one-to-many or many-to-many records within a single query, and potentially can have a negative impact on numeric reporting. In the example screenshot on the screen now, if we're looking at a particular vendor with an invoice amount total of $18,900, if we then add players to the report, that 15,210 line item may show up twice, as we see in the second screenshot, because of the unrelated nature of that second data set. Now, because the measures will auto-summarize, in this case it's summing themselves to the lowest level of detail, if we remove the approvers column, that players column from the report, while we leave it in the query, what ends up happening is that the data comes back from the database the same way that we saw at the bottom of the screen here. The 15,000 comes in 2 times. And the system then is auto-summarizing itself to the vendor level now. So we see, instead of the expected 18,900, we see 34,141. And the reason for that is because of that extra data in our single query. Now, there are a couple ways to avoid Cartesian products because there are a couple ways that they could occur, one of them being these extra fields. The first way to do it is to make sure that any invoice report is designed with this in mind. And so if you're designing a simple report that includes invoice information from only the base invoice folder, then you can use the total billed field present in the base invoice folder. So a simple report that subtotally invoices at the vendor level, you can use just that total billed from base info. However, if you're doing a line item report, that's going to include the professional or the line item date, or very often the cost type, so whether the item is a fee or a cost. That is stored at the line item level, and it's important at that point to use the total billed field from the invoice matter detail folder. Just as a quick example, if an invoice is for $100, the total billed field in base info has $100 in it. If we then go to the line item, and there are 10 line items at $10 a piece, the total billed at the line item level contains those $10 amounts, the total of which equals the base info total billed of $100. So the first thing to do is make sure that you're starting with the total billed or the adjusted amount, whatever the numeric field might be, from the level of info that your report needs within the invoice structure. The second method of avoiding a Cartesian product is to create 2 queries, one to contain all of the invoice information, and a second to contain all of the player information. And then by separating them in the report within a section based on the common field, the matter name and number, you can avoid any of that data duplication from occurring. I'm going to do an example of this so you can see the entire process from beginning to end. I'm in a demo environment with a lot of demo data. And I'm going to just start a brand new report. Now, when creating a new report, I'll just select the fields that I want to see. I'm going to start with some of those player fields. Because this is a demo environment, there's not a lot of data, so I can afford to leave the query filters empty for the sake of this example. More than likely in live environments, you'll need to make sure you have some kind of query filter so that your report does not take forever to run. So I now have a very simple report that lists all of the matters and their players along with their roles. If I go back to query, and from here try and add invoice information directly, we're going to find the exact situation that we saw in the slides. You get this information onto the report. I'm going to remove the original table and then just create a new one, just because that'll be, I think, the easiest way to get all of them into the report. Now, if we look at this output, it's not necessarily obvious that data duplication is occurring right now. Because of the sort order starting from the left moving to the right, the invoice number field looks like on every row it's different. The dollar amounts on the right also seem to be different. However, if we look at this 125236 invoice number and then skip down to the next matter name, we'll see that same 125236 again. Similarly, its dollar amount, 9,279, is also visible down here. So if we were to do a subtotal right now, we would be adding this same invoice twice into our totals. We can really see that if I add a sort based on this invoice number column, and we'll see that, for instance, this invoice number 0 shows up multiple times, once for each of these players on this matter name. So to avoid this, I'm going to go back into my query, and I'm going to create a second query to handle the invoice information. First thing I need to do is remove invoices from the player query. Next, I'm going to rename this query just so I know which query is which. I'm going to just give this a simple name that's descriptive to me. And then I'm going to duplicate this. Now in this new query that's going to handle invoices, I need to make sure that I'm not still referencing any of the player information, because then we're just going to recreate the same problem we're trying to fix in our second query. So I'm going to rename this, and then I'm going to remove any result object or filter that's based on players, so that this information in this query is specific to just invoices, and then those common fields, anything that's matter specific, that I can share between these different queries. Anything that I'm going to group my report on, basically. Now at this point, I can re-add my invoice information to this second query. And then I want to make sure that I'm not getting invoices that I don't actually want to see in the report. If in the players query, I'm filtering this to, say, only cases where a certain person is a player, I don't want to then report on all invoices across the system. I want to join these two queries together somehow. So to do that, that common field comes into play again, the matter name and number. I have a list of matters and players from the first query, and then I want just the invoices for those matters to show up. So to do that, I'm going to create a query filter based on that unique common field, matter name and number. And then on this right-hand side drop-down button, I'm going to select result from another query. That's going to let me select the matter name and number from my player query, and that way I'll be relating these two queries together. I'll only get the invoices attached to those matters that are already being returned by the first query, that player query. I'll hit Run Queries now. Now I had mentioned before that the definition of these individual fields can either be a conjoined queries, and they'll look something, or conjoined field definitions, or potentially it can be just the a field from a given query. And we can see that that's happened here because this field was on our report, this column was on our report before the second query existed. The system has clarified that this one right now represents only the player query's list of matter names and numbers. That may be correct in certain situations for certain reports, but for this report, I want all of the matters to be returned. I can replace this particular field with the combined object in a few ways, either by dragging the combined object on top of this field, or potentially by just removing the player dot portion of that formula. Both will have the same effect. Now this list is going to include all of the matter name and numbers from both queries. Because we're only getting the invoices and the matter name and number from the player query where it's already there, these two should be equivalent in this example, but there are times when they might not be, depending on how your queries are related together. The next thing I want to do is to create a section based on the matter name and number field. And then I can drag my invoice information into the report. We can do a number of things from this point to continue the formatting of this report and tweak that formatting to get us exactly what we want. If we're planning on exporting this output to Excel, this floating cell at the top of every section can make it a little bit difficult to get a clean export. So one thing I may want to do is to actually remove this floating cell while leaving the section in place, since that's what I'm using to group these two different data sets together. So I'll remove the cell. It's going to ask me you're deleting the section master cell? Do you want to delete the associated section on player? And in this case, I'm going to say no, because I don't want to delete the section. I just want to delete the cell. Once that is in place, I will be able to drag the matter name and number into my first table, so it's the leftmost object. I could drag it anywhere. I'm just going to put it there for the sake of how it looks. And then I can continue to play around with layout positioning. I can move this table up. I can get rid of this header row, so it's not repeating the header row over and over again down the page. It's also possible to align these two tables together, so to make sure that the tops are in alignment. And then also it's possible to go to the Format Table area and then conditionally position the second table so that it's just lined up with the right edge of the first table. That way when I do an Excel export, it'll really export very cleanly. As you can see, it's possible to try and manually line them up, but sometimes it's a little difficult to get them exactly pixel perfect, which is why that conditional positioning menu item is so useful. Now looking at the actual data that we have on screen, you can see that it's possible for there to be a matter with multiple players and no invoices. If I scroll down a bit, there's also examples where we have matters with a lot of invoices and then and then a shorter list of players. And this is why these two different data sets have to be kept separate from each other, is because there really isn't a direct relationship between either an individual invoice and an individual player, but there's also not a direct relationship between how many players and how many invoices we might get on our report. If I want to summarize these down to just a single row of data per matter, I can do that using those same aggregation functions that the numeric fields use by default: sum, average, percent, things like that. Count is another one. So from this point, I can do a lot with regards to the layout of the system, of the report, and it really is up to me what I want to do with it. But as you can see, looking at the output here on the total build column, we no longer have that data duplication occurring. And that's really the key part of using this method, is to isolate these two data sets and avoid a data duplication issue within invoices. Now, there's no limitation to how many how many queries you can have in a report. We may have a query that pulls all of the matters that fit our criteria for this report, then a second query that brings all the invoices back for those matters, another query that brings back the budgets for those matters, and then another query that brings back progress notes, or potentially just the most recent progress note for the associated records. Not all of the queries have to relate back to the first query either. We may have queries referencing the first one, and then a query that references one of those subsequent subqueries. And the important thing, however, is that you don't want to have too many queries, just because it becomes more complicated to keep track of everything and to maintain those reports later. So for that reason, the recommendation is to make just as many queries as is necessary to do the job, but no more. So your familiarity with query filters first, to limit records that come back into the report from a single query, is the place to start. You can then also limit records based on quick filters within the report itself, either at the record level, the table level, or the section level. But then there are times when creating more complex reports requires very different sets of data, and using multiple queries is the way to go in that case. It is also possible to create objects in the system, particularly I should say objects in the universe, that will do the same job as these multiple queries. If you find yourself creating reports that have a very similar design to them, and you end up having to recreate the same multiple query logic multiple times, that may be a good situation where instead of you creating that logic at the matter level, we would instead create a new object within your universe that does the same job. One example for that would be to create a new object that returns just the most recent progress note for a case. So instead of having to create a second query that calculates the most recent progress note separate from any invoice data, you would just pull a single object directly into your report, and it will just display the most recent progress note for that matter that it's attached to. Now, there's some other possible issues that you might run into when building reports that are not as involved as the multiple queries solutions. For instance, I've had a number of people who have gone to my classes then come back with a problem where every other page in their report is blank. And thankfully, this is a very simple solution, but it's not obvious at first glance. For example, if we look at this report, we'll see that page 8 shows data, everything looks good, but then page 9 is empty. And the way to resolve this is to actually click in the background empty space on page 9, and you'll see something like this occur. The background will turn gray, and then the non-gray sections, those horizontal white lines, are really what's telling us what's going on. And then in the main page design, there is a field that is too wide, but that leftover wide space doesn't have any content in it, so we can't see it. So it comes up as invisible. Just step back for a second to page 8. The field in question is this report title field. It actually extends all the way out over into page 9, which is causing the PDF renderer to add these extra blank pages. So now that we know that that's the problem, we can click on this report title field and either remove it or just shrink it down to fit within this page. And then we'll see that the extra blank pages disappear. Another area of the system that questions arise from often is formulas and variables. Formulas are probably the most complex aspect of Analysis Center potentially, but that's because of the amount of power that they hold. They're designed on purpose to look a lot and work a lot like the formulas within Excel. And so if you're familiar with Excel formulas, that familiarity will translate pretty quickly. And just as some very simple examples, the function current date in a formula will just return today's date. We can then use that in combination with the month filter, the month function, to return just the name of the month, September. A different function, month number of year, will return just the number of the year. What's going on here in these second two is the combination of two functions within the parentheses, so that the first function, current date, actually is the input for the second function. And by combining these functions together, we can create more and potentially more complex formulas to analyze the data within a report and really get very advanced reports doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you so that you're not having to do any manual work after you've run the report. Another common example is the rank function. The rank function takes in two input values, the number, numeric value, and then what you want to group that item by. In this example, we are going to create a top 5 states by their sales amount using this rank function. So the dimension in this case is the state name. The measure that is going to rank is the sales amount field. And on the right-hand side, you can see that it has done exactly that. We then have added a filter to this table to limit the results in that table to only those where that D-rank formula column is less than or equal to 5. Now, it's actually easier to do this in version 4 of the software. This is another area where some additional functionality has been added. And in version 4, there's actually just a window that pops up that lets you create ranking tables like this. You can select top 5 based on sales amount grouped by state. Click OK, and it will create this table for you. Another common need that is solved with report formulas is putting user prompt information onto the page header or footer of a report. An example of that being the enter start date, enter end date input parameters that are very common with reports. The way we would do that is with the user response function. First, we would create a pair of variables. In this case, I've named them report start date and report end date. They both use the user response function, and then inside double quotes, they reference the prompt text, which is whatever you have made the text that the user sees when they run the report. This is extremely exact. If the prompt text actually says enter date end with a colon on the end of it, and I don't include that colon inside the quotes, then this function will not return anything. So it's very important that you get the prompt text exactly right. But once we have created these two variables, we can then create a formula that references them to conjoin them into a single result with a dash in the middle. What this is doing is taking the output of the first formula and concatenating it with this little 3-character string here, space dash space, inside the double quotes, and then concatenating to the end of that the report end date input that the user provides when they run the report. So then every time the user runs the report, or different users run the report, whatever they enter into the user prompts will show up on the report header. This works for dates, it works for string inputs, it works for selection boxes. So if the user picks one or more matter types, you can see all of them listed. But it's very important to note that user response always returns whatever they have put in as just a text string. And that explains why in this result we actually see 1/1/2016 and then this time stamp. If we want to get rid of this timestamp, we can do a number of things to go about doing that. One of them being to take the fact that this is a string, report start date, and then use the left function and right function, very string manipulation functions, to actually cut off the end of this date. But there's an easier way to do that, and that is to tell the system that whatever the user has just given us is actually a date. And the way that we do that is to take the input from user response, enter start date, that we were just looking at, and use it as the input for a function called toDate. This toDate function takes in two inputs. One is a date string, so it's a string, but it has a date in it, like this user response. And the second part is the format in which that string is expected to be received. This string here is a little confusing the first time you see it. And that's okay because it's always the same every time you have an input date for a user response. It comes in this format. So this is one where you would write it once, make a note of what it is, and then you just copy and paste it into every formula you write from that point forward to do this. That's 2-digit month, 2-digit day, 4-digit year, hours. Lowercase m for minutes is really the key part. Uppercase for months, lowercase for minutes. Seconds, and then AM, PM. Once we redefined our two variables with this toDate function, then when we are actually building our final report output, we can choose exactly how we want to format these dates using the format date function, and we have full control over what it looks like. It can say 1/1/16, or it can say Tuesday, January 1st, 2016 in a very flowery style. So using those formulas are going to be what allows you to take your reports from very simple lists of items to very advanced analysis of the data. There are formulas that do sums and counts and averages, but there's also formulas that do standard deviation percentages as well. So if you wanted to do a statistical analysis of trends of your data over time, you would be able to do that, including going so far as to projecting missing data points from your data set over a trend line. So the formulas really do allow you to get into very advanced technical reporting if you so desire. A couple of other items that you may run into is you may be working on a report and you don't want to mess up what you've done so far, but you need to test something, or you want to just take a very detailed look at your data. You can always go down to the bottom of your report window and right-click on Report 1, where that tab is, and select Duplicate or Insert Report, which will create a new tab. Still going to use the same queries, it's referencing the same data. However, it's a clean slate for you to work on. You can then play around in that, test some variables and some formulas, and then when you're done, just delete that whole tab but you still have all your variables, you have all the formulas you've worked on in your report. So you can now add them to your main report tab. Now those report tabs work like worksheets within an Excel workbook, which is important with regards to things like formatting the report. If you were to format the report to letter, portrait, or landscape and legal, you can do that by right-clicking anywhere in the report, selecting Format Report, and setting those values here. However, each tab has its own settings for the page orientation. So if the first tab of your report is Portrait and the second tab is Landscape, when you go to export that report to Excel, you actually can have a PDF where the first couple of pages come from Report 1 as Portrait, and then subsequent pages from page 5 on are all Landscape. So you have a fair amount of flexibility in terms of your final report output once you're ready and you export it to PDF for distribution. And that is actually why, if you've ever noticed in the main menu of the system, there are two options for saving report to your local computer, the Save to My Computer As versus Save Report to My Computer As. The first one, Save to My Computer As, exports the entire report and all of the tabs to Excel, PDF, or character-separated values or comma-separated values. The second option, Save Report to My Computer As, only exports the currently selected tab. So we've gone through a number of things today, just the basics of building Analysis Center reports, how to build Analysis Center reports with multiple queries to solve problems like potential data duplication in advanced financial reports, and then finally how to triage some other common issues. And at this point, I'm going to hand back over to Abby so she can go over a couple updates, and then we can go through some questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. I set up the second poll question, so we'd love to have your opinions on that. Please go ahead and use the chat or Q&A. I do know that some questions have come in, and we'll get to those in a second. But Chris, if you want to advance to the next slide. I wanted to go over a few marketing updates. So hopefully you're all aware, we have Interact coming up in September. We have opened up registration. You can see the registration link on the bottom of that PowerPoint deck. I will have it in the email when I send out the recording, but we have the super early bird rate that is available right now. We also have the speaker rate. We are expecting about 400 attendees through all of our product lines, and that's going to be the 18th to the 21st in Scottsdale, and so we hope to see you there. Chris, if you want to go on to the next slide. We also are currently running our best practice forums. This is a half-day event that we do in the spring. They're listed in all different areas. So we have some in the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, New York, as well as in London, Perth, and Sydney. It's just a great way for you guys to meet up with other people who are using our products. We do a roadmap update, as well as just networking. So it's a smaller event. It's a half day, unlike Interact, which is a 2.5-day conference. So be on the lookout for that. And then the last slide, Chris, before we get to your questions. One thing I wanted to talk about is our client reward and referral program. So in case you were not aware, when you get up to about 1,500 reward points, that is a free Interact registration. So if you do not know where you are, feel free to email me, ask your account manager. But how you get those points, you can be a best practice host. You can help us with a webinar, case study, reference calls. Throughout the year, we do other events. We send out a survey this month asking for some feedback from our clients in the legal and compliance space. And on any client who registered to win the $100 gift card will also get 250 client reward points. So if you think about it, 250 times X many people, 1,500 points is really easy to get to. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware about those programs. Then lastly, we also have our idea portal. And so this is a great way for you to register. You can find it on the support page, which I'll show you in just one second. And so this is a way for you to tell us what new ideas you have for the products, as well as to vote on what your colleagues are asking for as well. Our product management team uses this greatly to help with the roadmap features. So Chris, if you want to go to the next slide, you can see that's our website. If you go to the support button, then you'll go to the, you'll see a list of all the different IDEA portals that we have. So we have one for Suite, Secretariat, things like that. But Chris, I want to go through some of the questions. We have a few minutes left. One of the first questions is how do we know which version of Analysis Center we have?
And that is an excellent question. The main difference is there's actually user interface differences. If you have, let's see if I can go back a few slides here. If you have a system which resembles what I have on the screen here, right here, then you're using version 2. If, however, the top area with toolbars looks very different and there's a lot of tabs and it looks a bit more like a Microsoft Ribbon interface, then you're using version 4. And it's a bit confusing because it's version 2 and then version 4. There's no version 3, and it's just a naming convention change. Because of the software versions behind the scenes, there was actually confusion with version 2 as far as which version of which software was involved, because version 2 actually uses version 3 of some software on the server side. So with version 4, we just lined up the numbers. So if you're not sure, but you're hosted with us, then at this point, you're almost certainly using version 2. But then moving forward, as we upgrade our data centers, you'll be upgraded to version 4.
Great. So another question is, I need to write reports that would show attorney time broken down by time versus paralegal time.
Attorney time over paralegal time, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so in that case, it probably would require a couple of steps just to make sure that we can separate those two things. The first thing I would do, just to limit this very, or to summarize this quickly, would be to first and foremost return only the players that I'm interested in. I'm just going to pick some for the sake of demonstration. And then, once I've run the queries, I can separate out the time for those different individual player roles by using a variable. And the syntax in question would be, if I'm interested in, say, total billed, or if I was interested in time, if I had a field, probably hours in your system, I want to return all of the hours where the player role is equal to whatever the value in question is, such as paralegal. So this variable would return just the hours where the associated player is paralegal. Depending on the data structure for your individual environment, we may not be looking at a player role. We might be looking at the time entry type, the time entry professional type. And we may also be pulling this information not from internal hours attached to tasks, but from the invoices themselves. In that case, the method would be the same, but we would look specifically at fields attached to the invoice. And so in that case, I would go down to invoices and then look at the professional and the hours units field. So I would create a variable that shows all of the hours / units where the professional in question is whoever that paralegal happens to be. We could also potentially look at the activity type or the task, depending on, again, the exact data structure that you're working with. But we could definitely do that, create two separate variables, one to return all the hours for a given lawyer or for the assigned attorney, and then another for all the lawyers for the paralegals, and then we can divide the two of them to get a ratio. I hope that answered the question.
If that doesn't, we will circle up with you offline to make sure that we did get that question right for you. Okay. I'm going to give everyone another minute or two just to see if there's any other questions that come in. Feel free to chat us or use the Q&A function. But as I said earlier, we did record this webinar. We will send out the recording. We had another version on Tuesday, covered the same materials, just a different time. So you'll get a recording link for both of the events. just so you have both of them. Chris covered most of the same stuff, but there was different questions in each one. But I'm not seeing any other questions come through, so I wanted to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Chris, for giving us all this knowledge. And, it looks like we'll have to sync up with you offline for the person who asked that question. Thank you again for attending, and we look forward to the next webinar with you guys.
Yes, thank you all very much for your time, and let us know if we have if you have any other questions that we can help you answer.
Great, thanks guys.